Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for some mood. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for some mood.
On today's episode of the Samood Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify activist, advocate, and author Medea Benjamin. Medea is the co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink, a feminist grassroots organization working to end U.S. warfare and imperialism, support peace and human rights initiatives, and redirect resources into healthcare, education, green jobs, and other life-affirming programs. New York Newsday described her as one of America's most committed and effective fighters for human rights. The LA Times named her one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement. She has received numerous prizes, including the Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize, the U.S. Peace Memorial Prize, the Gandhi Peace Award, and the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation Award. Medea, welcome.
Nice to be with you, Ed.
So, I have to say, you've called out Barack Obama, you've called out Donald Rumsfeld, and many others. You've taken on corporations like Nestle and Nike. You've been arrested or deported, I don't know how many times for how many countries at this point, fighting for the right causes. And you're the first known person to get an apology from Fidel Castro. Is it nature or nurture? What did your parents feed you in San Francisco? I have to know so I can give it to my kids.
Well, I didn't grow up in San Francisco. I grew up in Long Island, and my parents were not involved politically. If anything, I guess I would say they were Republican, but they weren't really concerned about politics. And I'm not sure. I think they fed me pretty lousy food in those days. There wasn't much of an emphasis on good, healthy food. So I remember a lot of macaroni and cheese. And I don't, what I do remember is that I wasn't really happy living on Long Island in the sense of being nourished politically. I did grow up during the days of the Vietnam War, and that really marked me. But I think the general sense I got was that I wanted to see the world and be part of a much larger world. And so when I was old enough, I left Long Island and have barely ever returned.
Understood. And that's correct. Long Island. And if I'm not mistaken, you were very rebellious, if I read correctly. And your parents had always kind of navigated you as a child because you were always challenging things or asking questions or asking why. And then that, if I got it correctly, that actually continued through high school as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I love my parents and they certainly loved me, but I was born in 1952 when it was in the 60s when I was coming of age. And that was a time when we really did have this theme of question authority, don't believe anyone over 30. And certainly it was a time of questioning a lot. It's funny when before this interview, you said to me, this is going to be really informal. It's like sitting and having a cup of coffee together. Well, Ed, I've never had a cup of coffee in my life, not even a sip of coffee. And that's because when I was young, I looked around at the world and I said, things are really messed up. There's people who are living on the street. There's tremendous poverty and tremendous wealth, and there's wars going on. And what is all this? And I thought, grown-ups drink coffee. Grown-ups have messed this up. I will never drink coffee in my whole life. So it might be very misplaced rebellion on the coffee side of things, but it's something I've kept up for for my entire life.
So, okay, we're having tea. And by the way, I wore pink for you today. I hope you see that.
Thank you. It's lovely. I would call it salmon, but it still fits in the
I
family.
tried, and I even tried to cover up the logo with my nice watermelon here, just to
Beautiful.
be supportive. You were organizing since high school. You were advocating since high school. Can you walk me through why you were doing that so early?
Well, I had my aha moment when I was in high school and my sister's boyfriend had been sent off to Vietnam. He was a real all-round American football player, nice guy, and kept sending her these weird letters month after month. Got weirder, and after about 6 months sent her a present. She was so excited, opened it up, and it was the ear of a Viet Cong, the quote enemy, to wear around her neck as a souvenir. And I went in the bathroom and threw up and said, something is terribly wrong. I'm going to start finding out what this war is about, why he was sent there, and what I can do about it. And so I did some research. And remember, in those days, we had no computers. So research was a tough thing to do. And realized that this was a terrible war. We shouldn't be in it. And started organizing an anti-war group in my high school, and joined the local Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and really became a skeptic about US government, realizing that governments can't be trusted, governments lie to you, and even lie when there are life and death issues involved. And I vowed to not just take on face value what my government was saying.
And you also, through the Vietnam War, I think you, if I read correctly, you dealt with a lot of or you witnessed a lot of racism within your school. I think it was a majority white, and I believe more of the Black community were moving in, and there was a struggle there. Can you kind of walk us through that?
You did your homework well, Ed. And this is, really in some ways a little separate from the Vietnam War, although there are intersections in there. But yes, I was living in a very middle class white community in Freeport, Long Island, and the neighborhood started changing. And I realized how racist my neighbors were, and I must say, even in my own family. And it started creating problems in the school itself, where there were stabbings in the school, where there were literally racial incidents on a regular basis, so much so that we had armed and helmeted police in the hallways trying to patrol and keep people from fighting with each other. And that was another indication to me about how messed up my country was, and even my community, where people couldn't live with each other in peace, much less live with neighbors very far away.
And you actually had a physical altercation with one of your classmates that later evolved into a relationship, I believe, in a good way.
Oh, I think you're talking about an incident where I had been given for my 16th birthday a bracelet by my mother, and it had my name and birthday engraved on the inside. And I was in the gym class, and it was stolen from me. And I saw in the coming days one of the black girls in the gym class wearing the bracelet. And I said to her, that's mine. And she said, no, it's not. And so we got into a fight. And I had the teacher take it off and look inside. And indeed, it was mine. And it had my name in there, kind of scratched out. But that became a basis for talking, because there was so much hatred, or not just hatred, but so much separation between blacks and whites, that became an opportunity to talk, to um, develop a friendship, which came out of that.
And how did you learn to organize and advocate so well?
Well, I don't know that I ever learned to organize and advocate so well. I keep saying that if I did, we wouldn't be in so many wars, and there could be more things I could say that I had accomplished over my lifetime. And I just don't say that lightly. I say that seriously, because we haven't been able to organize well to build a real anti war movement in this country. If anything, things have gotten harder, and the military industrial complex has gotten bigger, stronger, more intractable over these years. So I feel like I have tried, And in fact, if we get into some of the issues around the economy that I worked on, I can say that I made a whole lot more advances when I worked around economic issues, tangible, concrete results that I can point to, than I can point to on working around these issues of war and peace.
Yeah, no, I hope we do have that conversation as well. So you grew up in a Jewish household, but not political. Would you have called yourself Zionist or pro-Zionist in any
I
shape?
don't think I ever knew what the term Zionism was. In fact, for many years, I had never used that term. My parents never used that term, but they certainly loved Israel. And we would go to temple and always pray for Israel and send money to Israel and plant trees in Israel. And when I was quite young, I was sent to Israel to live on a kibbutz. And I think I was 15 at the time. It was right after the 1967 war, and there was at that time still very at the kibbutz where I was very socialist. So socialist, Ed, that the children didn't live with their families, their immediate families. The children grew up in a collective space for children. That's kind of amazing. And everybody, there was a lot of egalitarianism in terms of everybody worked hard in the fields. We all got up early in the morning, spent the day in the hot sun. We had our meals together. uh, there was a real collective spirit, except for one problem, and that was, quote, the Arabs, the local Arabs. And I couldn't, since I was dealing with racism back in my own school, I understood racism and realized that there was just a terrible attitude that the people on the kibbutz had towards the neighboring Arab villages. And that was something I picked up quite early on.
Did you get to engage with any of the local Palestinians there at all and have conversations with them, or were you pretty much siloed off?
Well, it's funny because you said that I was a rebel, and I was always a rebel. So when I was told by people in the kibbutz, "Don't go out there and talk to go in those villages with those Arabs. They're very dangerous." The first thing I wanted to do was go out there and talk to them, which I did, and I found people to be extremely warm and welcoming. Delicious food, way better than in the kibbutz, and I found some people who spoke some English. I made friends, and I realized that um, I, I started hearing more of their stories. And when I left the kibbutz, I did more research. I had never heard the term Nakba. I had never heard that there were Palestinians who had been displaced by the Jews who came in to live in the same land. And so these were things I started learning more about. But I must say, there were other issues for me to work on, like the Vietnam War. Then I got involved around Central America issues, Latin America, plenty of things that I could work on to bring more peace and justice. And I thought, well, even though the issue of Israel Palestine is an extremely important one, I didn't have to take that one on because I knew it would alienate my family so much. And I thought it was easier to kind of put that in the back, my to-do list later on, but not to get so involved in that. And so I worked on a lot of other issues for years until it became untenable to not take on that struggle straight on.
Talk to me about your school experience or your university experience specifically, because I believe you went in there and you were like, maybe not so much for me. And then you dropped out. And the way I read it, for me, my interpretation is that you got to tour the entire world and visit every country. I know that I'm being a bit hyperbolic there, but can you kind of describe that process and what you were thinking there?
Well, I went for a semester to Tufts University outside of Boston, and it had a graduate school there called the Fletcher School, that is renowned for its international relations And I was able to sit in on classes there while I was still a freshman. And what they were doing really made me just so upset, because it was about war games and gaming out how we would fight with the Russians, or at that time it was the Soviet Union, how we would manipulate to maintain as much control and world power as the US could, as if it was a monopoly game and we were trying to buy up as many of the buildings on the block. And I found it very disgusting and dropped out of school, because I also felt at that time, why be paying a lot of money to go to this very elitist school when there was a war raging, when there was so much more I felt I could learn out of school than sitting inside a school. And so I dropped out, and I spent many years traveling around the world until I eventually decided what it was I wanted to study and went back to school.
So you were supposed to marry a Jewish doctor and follow this very clear trajectory, right, of your life and school, and you decide to just walk away from that. What was your parents' response, or did you keep it from them?
Oh, they hated it. I mean, at first, when I dropped out of school, I pretended I was going on a study abroad to England, just so they would be okay with that. And then when I got there, I just, started hitchhiking around the world. They were very upset, my mother in particular, and she kept begging me to go back to school. And then over the years, she kept thinking, that this was a phase, that I was going to get back into the groove of marrying that Jewish doctor and having the kids and being a good Jewish girl from Long Island. The phase never ended. And I must say, I don't think she ever reconciled herself with what I was doing. But not all children are chips off of the old block, and certainly in my case, I didn't um, I didn't go along with the lifestyle. My parents' friends were Jewish. It was a Jewish kind of enclave. Um, it was a very small circle that I felt that they were listening to. And I wanted to have a much larger circle, which is why I ventured out into Latin America, to Africa, so many different places around the world.
And along that journey, I think it was in school or in college where you decided to change your name, correct?
Oh, that was early on. That was when I went to Tufts in the very beginning. I was still just 18 years old. And when I was in school, I was what everybody was named Susan at that time. And there was the little Susie, the big Susie, the medium Susie, the Susan, the this, the that. And I was little Susie. And I just did not feel like little Susie. It did not fit my ambitions. Not that I thought of myself as somebody grand. I just didn't feel like I wanted to be little Susie. And so I started experimenting in that first semester in college. We were reading the Greek tragedies. And so every month I would pick a name and ask my friends to call me by that name. And one of them was Medea. And even though it's a story of a tragedy of a woman with superpowers who, in one version, used her powers um, to kill her husband and her own children because he was unfaithful, I read and actually rewrote in myself a version of that story in which she was accused of that because she was a woman with secret powers, that she really didn't do those things, but it was blamed on her. And that was a time of women's liberation as well. And so I thought it was a nice name. I also liked the sound of the name. I thought it was a pretty name.
Yeah,
And so I took that.
it is. What's funny is I would tell a couple of people within my circle, hey, I'm going to be interviewing Medea Benjamin. And they're like, Medea? And then I pull up your image, like, oh, her, really? So you're all over, as you know, social media. So you're pretty prominent at this point,
Well, in some circles.
in a good way, in our circles. How about that? So when you left college and you decided to, or dropped out, I think you had some time in Africa, and then at that point you realize, you know what, if I need to make, or if I want to make an impact on the community, I need to go back to school and get an education. Can you walk me through that thought process?
Yeah, I think I spent about 4 years traveling around the world. I learned languages, I learned so much about different cultures. But at one point, I felt, well, I don't want to just keep traveling. I want to contribute something. And so I thought I should really go back to school and learn a skill where I could contribute. And I decided to go study public health and nutrition at the University of Columbia. And I don't know if I should say it, but in those days it was pre computer. So I didn't have an undergraduate degree, but I actually faked the undergraduate degree because I thought, oh, I don't want to go back to 4 year education. I want to go straight to the master's degree and really learn a skill. So, yeah, I kind of faked my undergraduate degree. And with that, I got into the Columbia Graduate School and did a master's in public health.
You definitely do not like rules. I love it. I love it. That's amazing. And the time period that you completed your master's, it was something, was it in 1 year?
I did the master's in public health in 1 year, and then later on, I did a master's in political economy at the New School for Political Research, and I did that in a year as well.
Okay. And after you completed your graduate school work and you graduated and you moved on, what was your first major job or gig that you started to work on?
Well, I got a job in the United Nations with the Food and Agriculture Organization based in Rome. And it was just what I thought was going to be a dream job. I didn't want to be based in Europe. I wanted to be based in Africa. And I especially wanted to be in one of the countries that was being newly liberated from its colonial masters. And I was particularly interested in Mozambique, which had been through such a bloody liberation war from the Portuguese. And that's where I got a job working as a nutritionist in one of the remote areas in the northern part of Mozambique.
Mm. When did the point with Nestle occur where you figured out something nefarious was going on?
Ed, you're amazing how much research you did. And that was when I was in Mozambique. I started realizing I was working in these rehydration camps for malnourished kids. And I kept seeing these malnourished kids coming in, and I didn't understand it. And started investigating and realized that these were children whose mothers had stopped breastfeeding. And they had stopped breastfeeding because there were these quote professionals, fake professionals. They looked like doctors, they looked like nurses, they wore white jackets, and they would go into these very poor villages and tell the women, don't you want your children to grow up healthy, like these white babies on our powdered milk containers? And if you do, you have to stop your backward way of breastfeeding and instead give this powdered milk. And so the women would get one free can of powdered milk. Their breast milk would dry up, and then they would start mixing the powdered milk with dirty water because they didn't have clean water. They would start diluting it because they didn't have enough money to then go and buy another can, and the babies would get sick. And they would come into our clinics on the verge of death. And I had children dying in my arms because of that. And I thought, how could this be that this company could be so evil to be sending fake professionals into poor villages to convince women to stop breastfeeding just so they could try to eke out a couple of dollars from these poor women.
But was it just for money, or did they know that there would be a more drastic impact on that community? Did they? Do you think they were trying to hurt this community? I guess that's what I'm asking.
No, no, I don't think so at all. I think it was just simply greed because when I did some research, I found out that this was happening all over. And this was part of their marketing strategy. And yeah, they were making a lot of money from this, a little bit of money, but from a lot of people.
Yeah. And then after, and I know I'm jumping a little bit, but my understanding is you had trouble keeping a job because you were so outspoken and you would call out the BS. Is that accurate?
Yeah, but let me first say on the issue of Nestle's, I was so incensed by it that I wanted to go to Nestle's headquarters and do something about it. I went to a UN gathering of nutritionists where I thought I would bring up this issue that I had been seeing in the villages where I worked in Africa, and flew all the way to Brazil where this UN gathering for nutrition was happening. Went there the night before it started, and what do I see? Sponsored by Nestle's. And I couldn't believe it. And so I rounded up some Brazilians to help me, got some red paint and a ladder, climbed up the ladder, and put Nestle's, where it said Nestle's, wrote kills babies, and made up some signs to take into the hallways the next day. And as I started putting them up on the walls, I suddenly found my arms pinned back behind me, and these plainclothes police whisked me off into a police unit. In those days, Brazil was still under a dictatorship. I was interrogated, and finally, the US Embassy came to, quote, bail me out by agreeing or insisting that I be deported. And so I was deported from Brazil and then joined a much larger movement that I didn't know existed, to an international movement to stop Nestle's from doing that. And it ended up being a very successful campaign with the first international agreement that Nestle's was forced to sign onto, changing the way they did their quote marketing practices.
Got it. And at what point did you get involved, or am I going too far down the road already with Nike and the situation with them and sweatshops and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I realized that going after corporations was very important to do, and that it was actually easier to move corporations than it was to move governments. Because in my time in Africa and Latin America, I had seen so many examples of US government interference, overthrow of democratically elected governments, etc. But it was really hard to change government policy. In the meantime, I also saw the pernicious effect of U.S. companies. We talked about Nike, about Nestle's, but the banana companies, and then later on, the companies like the shoe companies, the sweatshop companies, that were abusing labor. And so I started getting involved in those areas, sweatshop companies, Levi's, Abercrombie and Fitch, all whole host of um, companies that were making clothing, as well as the shoe companies. And Nike at that point was really just growing tremendously. And they were shutting down factories in the United States, and moving overseas and picking the most repressive countries to work in. So they were picking Indonesia, at that point, China and Vietnam. And I would travel to those countries to see the conditions and then expose them in the US press, as well as bringing some of the Nike workers, like in the case of Indonesia, over to the United States to tell their stories firsthand about what the factories were like. And these were great campaigns because the media was really interested in it. Unlike a lot of our work against war, I think the media found it more interesting to talk about companies that people know and love. And so we were able to get a lot of exposés about Nike, for example, and force Nike to change some of its worst practices. For example, stop using toxic chemicals in the factories, change the living conditions of the workers, provide fresh drinking water, and to start paying overtime, which it wasn't doing. So I felt that that work was extremely successful in at least somewhat improving the lives of many tens and thousands of workers.
And you may not be able to speak to this, and I'm not calling out Nike if this is incorrect. It's just so don't try to sue us here. But are they also using, or is another apparel organization using Uyghur labor?
Well, there are a number of companies that are using Uyghur labor as part of their China labor. And it's not just Nike. In this case, the US government is concerned about it because it's part of their campaign against China. But when it's US allies that are using repressive labor, the US government doesn't say anything about it.
Yeah. So Medea, how many times have you been arrested, deported? Because I think one time you actually landed with a broken arm. Is that right?
Yes, I've been arrested a number of times. In fact, in the work that we were doing around sweatshops and Levi's headquarters was where I was living at the time in San Francisco. And we would do protests and get arrested there on a regular basis when some of the big electric companies were gouging the US consumers and causing a crisis. We were getting arrested at the government office is dealing with that on a regular basis. And since then, I've been arrested numerous times around these issues of war. But what you're talking about is something that happened to me in Egypt. I mentioned earlier that I hadn't been doing the work around Israel, but I did start doing that back in the 90s and in the years 2000. And we actually started to take groups to Gaza on a regular basis to see what the Israelis were doing there in the incursions that they were doing into Gaza on a regular basis way before October 7th. And one of those times when we were trying to take 100 international women, I was stopped at the airport in Egypt because we would have to go through Egypt because Israel would not let us into Gaza. And I was held, and the they were trying to force me to get on a plane, and I was saying no, I want to talk to the US embassy. And five guys jumped on top of me and pulled me so hard that my arm came out of my socket, stuffed my scarf into my mouth, and started dragging me to try to deport me on a plane. And I was in such pain that the plane wouldn't let me get on until they realized that the Egyptians weren't going to allow me to go to a hospital and put me on the plane. And one of my lucky stars was that there was an orthopedic surgeon on the plane who actually turned it into a little hospital room and reset my arm until I got to Turkey and was taken to the hospital there.
Was this, and I hope I get the order right, was this at that point, were you with the Global Exchange Human Rights Group?
Yes, I had started a group called Global Exchange to take people outside the confines of the United States to see the world from the point of view of people in other countries. And that organization still goes on, still organizing those kind of trips. And I still think it's so important for people in the United States to try to leave this country if they have the money, if they have the opportunity, if they can get themselves a passport, because seeing the US from outside the United States can give you a very different perspective.
Yeah. I just want our audience to hear this because a lot of individuals have sort of been introduced to you because of this most recent situation in Palestine with the genocide. And I want to make it clear you've been doing this since day one, even back in high school. So I think it's important for people to hear that.
Yeah, it's been over 50 years. I've, done different things throughout the years, but also always one thread in my life was trying to find ways to end wars because I just see the death and the destruction and the a vast amount of resources that we in this country and as a global community spend on killing each other instead of making our lives better.
Yeah. So we talked about global exchange, but you also uh, a co-founder, I believe, or maybe founder of Peace in Ukraine Coalition, and then Unfreeze Afghanistan, and maybe many more that I'm not aware of. I'm pretty good at research, but I think I missed some things here.
Well, the first thing we should talk about, I think, is Code Pink, my T-shirt on here,
That's my segue. Yeah, that's where we're getting. Yep.
because that came after Global Exchange. I was with a group of women, and we were actually in a retreat to talk about the environment. And this was right after the 9/11 attacks, and we couldn't help but talking about what our government looked like they were going to do instead of going after individuals who attacked us and bringing them to justice was going to use this to justify invading Afghanistan and invading Iraq. And so we started organizing, and there was a color coded alert at that time, the yellow, orange, red alerts to try to keep the American people in this state of fear all the time, and that there would be another terrorist attack. And we wanted to have another color coded alert, and we wanted it to be code hot pink because we thought it was something that would be show the alarm bells, but that was a porn site, so we couldn't get that. So we became Just Code Pink. And it's been an organization now that's been around for the last 22 years and has been focused on this issue of how do we transfer our resources from the military industrial complex into things like healthcare, education, the environment, and trying to stop. We went from trying to stop the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and organizing around the country to do that, unfortunately unsuccessfully, to where we are today, trying to stop the U.S. support for Israel's slaughter of people in Gaza. And in the meantime, I have been involved in these other organizations that you mentioned in trying to deal with U.S. horrific policy in places like Afghanistan, where we spent trillions of dollars killing people, but then didn't want to help rebuild, and in fact stole $7 billion of their money that was in U.S., mostly U.S. reserves, instead of giving it back to the Afghan people.
And there's a misconception that you all are in great support of the Democratic Party. But what people don't realize is that when Obama became president, you moved from San Francisco to DC, right? Because you wanted to basically keep him in check and see if he actually follows through on his promises during his campaign. But you lost a lot of support. And I don't know if a lot of people know that.
Absolutely. We lost a lot of support for taking on the issue of Israel early on, and we lost a lot of support during the Obama years, where we were watching what he was doing, for example, with drone warfare. I wrote a book about the use of drone warfare, which is really one of Obama's signatures. We took groups to both Pakistan and Yemen to see the effects of US drone warfare on innocent people in those countries. We also realized that under Bush, they had rounded up over 800 people and thrown them into indefinite detention in Guantanamo, but that Obama kept that prison going as well. And we met with the families of prisoners in places like Yemen and called out the Obama administration on this as well. And there's one time that I managed to get inside a talk that Obama was giving at the Defense Institute and called him out on this issue of drone warfare and the Guantanamo indefinite detention as well.
Yeah, that's the famous scene where he said, what that lady or young lady is saying we should listen to, I believe it was.
Yes, which was kind of funny because I'm 10 years his elder, but he uh, he it didn't really listen because he kept up those policies, and they continue today in steroids. I mean, look at what drone warfare has become today. And we at Code Pink don't have an interest in party politics. We are not siding with the Democrats or Republicans. We think that both of them are war parties. And while some of us as individuals are supportive of third party efforts, it's such a shame that in this country, third parties don't really have a chance because the two party system is so ingrained. But we think of them both as war parties with some notable exceptions within the parties, but for the most part, both of them follow the dictates of the military industrial complex.
And I think it's worth noting you actually ran with the Green Party many years ago as well. Is that correct?
I did. That was back in 2000 when Ralph Nader was running for president and I was running against Dianne Feinstein in California. And, it was a great exercise in how undemocratic our system is, because even though in my case I was raising hundreds of thousands of dollars, I had great support going around with Ralph Nader. We had these, huge gatherings, huge rallies, much bigger than Dianne Feinstein could ever pull off. And yet I wasn't allowed into the debates. I wasn't allowed to be considered by the media as a credible candidate. And that, of course, happens constantly to people who want to run as third party candidates.
Had I been living in California, I think I would have voted for you, if that makes
Thank you.
sense. Yeah. So you gave a TED talk talking about drones about 10 years ago. And the way I viewed it was you were warning us that this is going to get bad. And I don't think everybody appreciated it. There is this understanding, well, if we send drones and we lose less human life on our side, or there is less of a chance for somebody on our side to get harmed, not realizing that there are innocent people being killed on a daily basis. And we're seeing right now what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, specifically with drones, constantly buzzing, constantly intimidating them. Why did we not listen to you 10 years ago?
Well, you said it. And when I see some of these reports from Gaza and you hear the buzzing in the background and you think, how can people live with that constant fear above their heads? And this has been the evolution of warfare. And the US really initiated this by saying, we don't want to see any more of our soldiers killed because the American people don't like that. And so, a better way to wage these wars is by remote control. So, you see the evolution from my days in Vietnam, where U.S. There was a draft, and people were sent over in large numbers to fight overseas, to a quote volunteer army, to now a way of waging wars either by drones, and in the case of the US by proxy, because there are wars we're waging in Ukraine where we don't send any soldiers. But in the case of drone warfare, we see that evolution and how Israel is using those drones and the tremendous industry that Israel has built up with drone warfare and artificial intelligence in general in waging wars. I think the Pope has just come out, maybe yesterday, calling for the end or stopping the use of autonomous weapons. But this is a horse that's been out of the gates now for a long time. And yes, I wrote about it, I think back in 19, I think I forget how many years ago it was, but it was way over a decade ago, saying that this is going to lead to exactly what it's led to today. And the victims right now are the poor people in Gaza, as well as elsewhere around the world. Turkey has developed its own drone warfare. The Russians have drone warfare. Iran has developed sophisticated drones. So it's all over the world now, and it's just led to another level of horror for people who are on the receiving end.
Yeah, if I remember watching or reading correctly, the Israelis were adding a crying baby sort of noise on the drone to draw people out and then kill them.
Horrific. Yes, horrific.
Yeah. Do you think, or do you know if, I think I know the answer, but I want to ask you anyway, specifically with drones, are they testing on the Palestinians? Are they?
Well, yes, and they have been for years, since, and this can go back to Obama time when the Israelis were invading Gaza in 2008 in December, as well as in January of 2009. I remember we were outside the hotel where Obama was living before he was going to be in the White House. And every day we were out there saying, Obama, say something about the horrific attacks that were going on in Gaza. And his response was, there's only one president at a time. And he wasn't going to say anything until he was in the White House. And then, of course, when he was in the White House, he was totally supportive of Israel. So, yes, this has been going on, this testing, and the Israelis in their business, in their marketing materials, talk about how these are field tested. And of course, they're field tested in Gaza.
And are you affiliated with Code Pink with the BDS movement? Is there any synergy there?
Well, Code Pink has been part of the BDS movement for many
Yeah.
years. We took on companies like Ahava that was producing its products, um, lotions and things in occupied territories. We took on the issue of SodaStream that was also making its products in occupied territories. We were doing a campaign around Remax, the realtor that was selling properties in occupied territories. And we have, in general, been part of the BDS movement for a long time.
Yeah. And I want to go back to Obama for a second, because again, you all lost a lot of supporters for calling out Obama. What's your read on it now, looking back? How much of a mistake was it for individuals to vote for him? I'm asking in general, not getting political per se, but how disappointed should we be in Obama? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Well, I think in the first round, people were right, very excited to support him. I mean, let's be real, having a black president is extremely important historical opportunity for the United States. But then seeing the evolution of his policies, I do want to say that there are a couple of policies that I was very supportive of, and that was the Iran nuclear deal that really helped to ease tensions in the Middle East. And it was done with the opposition of Israel and other forces in the United States that didn't want to see that deal concluded. And the other was the opening of diplomatic relations with Cuba that was extremely important and was such a win-win for both the US companies that wanted to sell more products in Cuba, as well as for the Cuban people and the Cuban economy that really started to thrive as soon as the opportunities were opened up. And those, unfortunately, were both reversed when Trump came into power. So those are two examples of positive things that Obama did. There were other examples of very negative things. We did talk about drone warfare, for example. But I do think that at this point in our history, people should understand that there really isn't that much difference between the Democrats and Republicans, especially when it comes to foreign policy.
And I think a lot of the individuals in the Palestinian diaspora are figuring out that the hard way, unfortunately.
And a lot of young people are. And actually, that's something that gives me tremendous hope when I see at so many of these encampments that sprung up around the country, and having visited some of them, that talking to the young people and seeing the educational work they were doing, they saw the issue of U.S. support for Israel as one example of U.S. militarism. And they were educating each other on the much broader issues of the US war machine, of the need to have a different kind of economy in this country that wasn't dependent on producing weapons to kill people. And so I think there is a new generation that's being created now that does understand the US support for violence in our own country as well as violence overseas.
So, talk to me about Code Pink's strategy right now. Every time I watch the news or I listen to some spokesman from the government speak, I'm quite literally waiting for you to jump out and interrupt them. Can you walk me through the strategy, walk me through the organizing? Because you all are so impactful. It's just amazing.
Well, we're always trying to interrupt people who are promoting war. And now there's a lot of groups who are doing it. And I'm so excited every time I see somebody popping up to interrupt Biden. We just had recently 2 days of hearings with Anthony Blinken, in which he testified in Congress 4 times, and we had people interrupting him every single time. And this is not something that Code Pink has done, but something that we're extremely appreciative of are the ongoing encampments that have been happening outside the home of Anthony Blinken and outside of the Israeli embassy here in Washington, D.C., that is mainly run by Palestinian Americans and is such a huge sacrifice that people are making to be there day after day after day. And then in terms of people all over the country, not only interrupting the national figures, but also their local figures, members of Congress, members of their city councils, everybody who calls themselves a leader being interrupted if they continue to support the Israeli genocide. And I think that's extremely positive. We can't let these people get away with pretending that what Israel is doing is self defense. It is not self defense, it is murder of a vast majority of the people murdered are civilians, are women and children and innocent men. It's collective punishment, and now it's starvation. So it is very important to get the word out however we can. Interrupting them is just one way to do it.
And it's important to note that it's not just Palestinians. If this was happening with any other group, Code Pink would be activated at that moment to do the very same thing.
Absolutely. You know, if it was the other way around and it was the Israelis who were being attacked, we would be there. And of course, myself as a Jew, I would definitely be there. And, you know, we are a group that supports people who are fighting oppression all over the world. And, but we do have a limited number of resources. And when I say resources, it's not really about money, it's about time and energy, because most of Code Pink is run by volunteers, despite what you might hear in the media of attacks that we are funded by China or Russia or Iran or Venezuela or whatever. We are mostly a volunteer run organization. And so we have to make choices, and we decide that where we should put our energy is in those conflicts where the US is playing a major role and where it's our tax dollars and our bombs that are being used to kill people. And so if you look at it through that lens today, the number one priority for us is Gaza and the Palestinian the Palestinian issue in general, because it's not just Gaza, it's also the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
And you recently crashed an APAC party. Is that right?
We did. That was a gathering of the high level strategists for APAC. And it's interesting because we do have friends on the inside all over the place. And somebody told us about that. It was kind of a secret gathering, it wasn't advertised anywhere. And we managed to get ourselves into that and interrupt it with the message of saying that you in APAC are destroying our democracy, are desecrating the Jewish religion, and that you have blood on your hands because you have been supporting the slaughter of the people in Gaza. But we also think it's important that we focus on AIPAC, the way that it is throwing money into the electoral process to try to get rid of anybody who sticks their head out and says anything about the oppression of Palestinians. And it is such a shame that they are going after people like Jamal Bowman, Representative Cori Bush, people who have called for a ceasefire. And if we let AIPAC get away with that, there will be nobody in Congress who's willing to say what Israel is doing is a genocide, it's ethnic cleansing, it is something that violates international law as well as US law, and we have to stop supporting it.
And APEC is actually recruiting individuals and paying them to run against other individuals that are pro-Palestinian. Is that correct?
Well, that's right. And that's why you can't just look at the money that politicians are receiving from AIPAC. You also have to look at the money that AIPAC is pouring into putting forth challengers to those members of Congress. And you also have to look beyond AIPAC to see what the Christian Zionist movement, like CUFI, Christians United for Israel, are doing. So it's even broader than the Jewish lobby. Is a big pro-Israel lobby that is pouring now. Just AIPAC alone is saying that it's putting $100 million into these elections.
What was the name again? Kufi, you said?
CUFI, Christians United for Israel.
And they're doing similar work to APAC?
Yes, they are. They have big mega churches, and they have a lot of reach in the Christian community. In fact, there are people like the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who is a Christian Zionist. Some of these Christian Zionists believe in the apocalypse and that you have to get support the settlements in Israel and more Jews going back to Israel so that it will accelerate the second coming of Christ when everybody but those who convert will be saved and the rest will be annihilated, including the Jews who don't convert. So it's a marriage of convenience for the time being. But it is quite incredible how influential this Christian Zionist movement is inside our Congress.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually very scary altogether. So, how do you suggest we as a community combat these Kufi or combat APAC or even ADL? What do we have to do on our side?
Well, you mentioned the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which I think is extremely important. On the government level, what we have to be pushing for is an arms embargo. This is something that the International Court of Justice has called for, and even some of our allies in Europe, and including Canada, are starting to implement because there is a lot of grassroots pressure. Right now, there is a member of Congress, Ayanna Pressley, who will be introducing a bill calling for a 1-year embargo on offensive weapons to Israel. Some of us would like larger than 1 year and on all weapons to Israel, but we're not going to get that in this Congress. And it's going to be even hard to get a significant number of members of Congress to join onto this bill. But as soon as it's introduced, it's something that's important for us to try to get as many members of Congress to be supportive of. There are efforts at local levels to call for not only ceasefire resolutions, but also for divestment from companies that are invested in Israel. And that's very important to do. That's what students are calling for at their universities. That's what many groups in their cities are calling for. That's what people are calling for in their pension funds. So those kinds of things are very important, but also important are things related to the cultural issues. I remember in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, how important it was to get South Africa to be barred from participating in FIFA, in the soccer games, in Olympics, in other important international venues. And that is really very important when it comes to the symbolic support for or opposition to Israel. So I think those efforts on the sports level are important. Getting more cultural workers to speak out. These are all critical things. I am working in the halls of Congress every day, and I think it's so important, especially in the summer months when Congress people are back in their districts, like in the entire month of August, that we protest at any venue where we can find them. Do your research, find out where they're speaking, if they're having a meeting with their donors, if they're having any town hall kinds of meetings, and be there to speak out. So those are some of the things that we can be doing.
So somebody wanted me to ask you this two questions really. How do you get the courage to do this? And are you nervous every time you interrupt or anytime you shout out? Do you get nervous? Is that normal to get nervous?
Well, I'll take the second one first. It's very normal to get nervous. It would be a little weird if you weren't nervous. I mean, you're nervous about a lot of things. When it's interrupting a president, you're thinking, oh my God, should I really be doing this? You're nervous about how you're going to be physically attacked and thrown out of there. And certainly as I get older, I get more worried about my bones. And you're nervous about what the reaction will be. You're nervous about whether you'll be able to pull it off. Can you really jump onto the stage? All kinds of things. Will I be able to pull out my banner in time? Will I hold it right side up instead of upside down, as many of us have done? All kinds of things that you worry about. So yes, it is normal to be nervous. But it's important to overcome that. And that really gets at your first question about how to overcome it and why to overcome it. I watch on a daily basis what is happening in Gaza because it's so important to me to see the reality on the ground. And we now have, through social media, a way to do that. And it is heartbreaking. It is inhuman. It is brutal. I think as a mother, as a grandmother, I look at these little kids and I think about my own grandchildren and how could I live if this was happening to them? And I think that kind of anger at what Israel is doing and knowing that it's with our bombs is what fuels a lot of us to do this kind of work, to get out of our comfort zone. And, there are many ways to get out of our comfort zone. We have friends who have been doing hunger strikes and going in front of the White House every day with signs saying that they're on a hunger strike to stop the killing. There are people who are resigning from their government work and from other places, including the high tech business, to say, I can't continue to work in places that are contributing to this, and doing it in a public way so that people can hear and the media will pick up on this kind of dissent. Yes, I think it's important to have courage. I think it's important to step out and do things that make us uncomfortable.
And what's your advice for those individuals and this frustrates me, that's why I'm asking you. I still haven't figured out how to answer it. Maybe you can, but you know what? We need to be strategic here. It's not the right time to speak out. When is the right time at this point?
Yeah, I think this interview, which has been really great, and thank you for the time and the length, it's to say that it's always the time to speak out. I mean, especially now, of course, when what we're seeing every day is a genocide in our lifetimes. But it's important to speak out all the time, whenever we can, especially those of us who are more privileged, who have more ability to speak out, who face less consequences. I feel very sorry for young people today who have loans they have to pay back and so are very limited about the kind of work they can do, are worried about getting arrested because what will it mean to their future? And, those who are risking their futures by speaking out, I have a lot of admiration for. And then there are people like me who are in their retirement. And I love a lot of the people going around Congress with us are people who are retired and say, what better things can I do in my retirement than this? There's a woman who's been going around with us on maternity leave. She's ready to give birth any day now. And she's saying, what better thing could I do on my maternity leave than fighting to make the world better for the baby that I'm going to be bringing into this world? So the time is always right. The people that we've been waiting for is us. And if anybody who's listening to this wants to join us anytime in the halls of Congress, we welcome everybody. We're there every single day from 9 to about 3 in the afternoon. You can join by going to codepink.org to the events page. But of course, we need you not just in Washington, D.C., but anywhere. So if you go to codepink.org and sign up, there's plenty of things that you can do in your own community.
No, thank you for that. So, Medea, I interviewed Phyllis Bennis the other day, as I mentioned to you, and I told her that in the face of war, in the face of apartheid, in the face of injustice, there are two people who's always going to run to stop it. It's you and her, and I so appreciate all the work you're doing. My last question, which I always ask, is what do you want your legacy to be?
Well, I want my legacy to be having mentored a lot of younger people on the importance of doing this work, not just for 1 year or 2 years, but really making it your life's work. Not that you necessarily make it your paid work, but to put some time in during your lifetime to be building up much more of a movement, and a movement that recognizes that when there finally is hopefully a ceasefire around Gaza, that doesn't mean that we can relax. Maybe we don't have to be in such a furious pace as we are now, but we have to keep up this work. Our government, as we said from the time of Martin Luther King, is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. It's not the only purveyor of violence. Certainly, we see Russia as purveying violence in Ukraine. We see Israel as a purveyor of violence. We see the U.S. The alliance that the U.S. leads of NATO as a huge purveyor of violence around the world. And there are countries in Africa, for example, in Sudan, where there is tremendous violence going on that the U.S. is not necessarily involved in. So, but it's to understand that the U.S. is the largest purveyor because we have the largest military by far. We put the largest amount of our resources into this by far. And I want people to realize that whether your number one issue is the environment or it is about issues of racial equality or issues of um, uh, getting rid of the student debt or healthcare for all or affordable housing. It's all connected because as long as we put $1 trillion of our wealth, a massive amount of money into the military, we will not have the money that we need for all of these other things. So, in terms of legacy, I hope it would be to have educated more people about the need to be fighting to transform our country into one that focuses on a war economy, into one that is building a peace economy, a different way of living in the world that recognizes the need to cooperate in the world and promote our common humanity.
Thank you so much. I do want to let the audience know Medea has written, I believe, almost 11 books. You do have a book coming out. Just want to give you an opportunity. Would you like to talk about that before we say bye to you?
It's called NATO, What You Need to Know. We wrote it. I wrote it with David Swanson of World Beyond War because this is the 75th anniversary of NATO. It's going to have its 75th anniversary meeting here in Washington, D.C. During the days of July 7th to 9th. It's an important time because NATO is shoring up its strength to keep the U.S. and the Western powers in a constant state of war, whether it's war in Ukraine, whether it's war in the Middle East, or whether it's this pivot to China that has been touted for for over a decade now. And so it's very important to understand what is NATO, what is its purpose, what is its strategy, and why it's important to oppose NATO as an offensive, not a defensive military alliance.
Thank you so much, Medea. I do appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Ed. It's been great talking to you.
Have a good one.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for some mood. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for some mood. Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for some mood.